Thank you, Francesca, and what a great intro that was. By the way, on this slide here, I've noted a website you can go to for much more information. I've had to cut this down considerably, but Francesca mentioned issues of law. It turns out that a lot of the law of baseball is based on opera, and you heard a song earlier about a young girl who was a pitcher. It turns out that there was an actual 17-year-old girl who struck out both Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth in 7 consecutive pitches. That actually happened, and that's related to opera also. Those things I will not tell you about today because you have a matinee to go to, but I will stay here and answer any questions you have. So, to show that I'm right up to date, this very week on Sunday, Joe Torre was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. And he has something interesting in his possession. It's an autographed baseball. Now, what's so special about an autographed baseball? It's who it was autographed by. This baseball was autographed by Luciano Pavarotti. It's one of 4 baseballs that were autographed by Luciano Pavarotti, and they are signed by 4 people: Luciano Pavarotti, Joe Torre, Stan Musial, and James Michener. Musial, Torre, and Michener used to go to the opera together. And they went to a performance of Tosca that Pavarotti was doing, went to see him in his dressing room, and Stan Musial started pulling all these baseballs out of his wife's handbag and had everyone sign them. A lot of ball players used to go to the opera. You can see in the upper left there is Yogi Berra with Eleanor Steber. He's demonstrating a grip for her. Then there's Sandy Koufax, who his teammates used to complain when they were down in the bar, he was up in his hotel room listening to opera. Down at the bottom left is Ty Cobb. Ty Cobb and opera. He actually had a pass to the Detroit Opera House. He was introduced to serious music at the Detroit Opera House. He loved it. He attended opera all over the place. In Syracuse once, he was guest of honor at the opera. And then we have Beverly Sills and Robert Merrill and George Steinbrenner. Steinbrenner was very heavily involved in opera. And then at the right is Babe Ruth and Dorothy Jordan. And notice the expression on Ruth's face. He's kind of tentative and shy. Well, Robert Merrill tells the story of one time Mickey Mantle coming over to him and being very tentative and shy and wondering if he could get an autographed recording from him. But this is the most special. That's Lou Gehrig on the right, of course. And next to him, for those of you familiar with opera, is Kirsten Flagstad. Now, why am I showing that? Well, Lou Gehrig set a tremendous number of records in baseball. And one by one, they've been broken. So down at the bottom left, I'm showing Cal Ripken Jr. on the day that he beat Lou Gehrig's record for consecutive games played. And then at the top left is Derek Jeter, who just this past month beat Lou Gehrig's record for doubles at the Yankees. But Gehrig has one record. By the way, if he hadn't succumbed to the disease that has his name, those records probably would stand forever. But there's one record that he has that probably will stand forever, and it's an opera record. And what happened was, as with many men, he was dragged to the opera the first time by his wife. And the opera that he went to was Tristan und Isolde. That's a 5-hour opera. And it's in German, and they didn't have titles in those days. But it turns out that Lou Gehrig was fluent in German. And so he's watching the opera, and they get to the Liebestod again at the end, the love death, and it's just so moving that tears are streaming down his face at the end of the opera. So what does he do? He goes to every single performance of Tristan and Isolde that season. So never mind 21, 81 consecutive games. 7 consecutive performances of Tristan. 5 hours each. No ball player is ever going to equal that record. Here's Ricardo Muti pitching for the Cubs. He just threw out the first pitch in 2012. No big deal. But I will show you some other people. So this is the Mighty Casey. You heard about that. It was performed at Glimmerglass in 1989. It was also performed here in 1986. It's considered the baseball opera, but it isn't. There have been other baseball operas since the Mighty Casey, and there were baseball operas before the Mighty Casey. This is probably the first baseball opera. It was first performed in 1988. It's called Angela or the Umpire's Revenge. The words and music were by Paul Eaton, but it was scored by John Sousa. It was performed at the Grand Opera House in Philadelphia, not the Academy of Music, on June 29, 1988, and the reports of that performance, spectacular rounds of applause, a brilliant effort, brought down the house, but I have not been able to find a record of any other performance of it. Just that one. But baseball appeared in opera even before that. So here is an opera called The Black Hussar, or that's what it was called in the United States anyway. And one of its trios is called Read the Answer in the Stars. And the trio was done by Matilda Cotrelli, Digby Bell, and DeWolf Hopper. And there's the baseball phrases from the trio. The small boy seized his baseball bat. He cried, "Well, let her come." The baseball flew. The small boy flopped. It knocked him deaf and dumb. He rallied, though, with one eye out. He gave his spine a rub. Said he, "I'm not dead yet. I belong to the New York Baseball Club. This is a game of grace, although we call it base. But when home runs are all run out, where shall we look for sport? Read the answer in the stars. They're all shortstops. Stop short." Well, here's another Hall of Fame induction speech. This was in 1976 by Bob Lemon, who was a longtime Cleveland pitcher. And he says he was born in September, and his mother had to see the World Series at the old Opera House in Redlands, California. Now, the series was an East Coast and Midwest series that year. So how was she watching the series in Redlands, California in 1920? Well, it turns out people had gone to opera houses to watch baseball starting in 1885. What happened was there would be 3 telegraph operators. One telegraph operator would be at the game and would telegraph the plays back to the theater, where there was another telegraph operator who would read what the play was. And then a third telegraph operator would move some things around. It started out, you can see down at the bottom, they had a blackboard in Augusta at the Opera House. In Atlanta, they had young boys running around a ball field that was painted on the stage and recreating the plays. And then there was some more technology that was added. These are some of the improvements. The first one just had a depiction of the ball field. The second one actually had cranks so they could move the players around at whatever speed they were moving. Electricity was added after that. By the way, those first 2 were patented, and the patent rights earned enough for the purchase of the Boston Post. Then androids were introduced. And the one at the left was introduced first at the Academy of Music in Richmond, and the one on the right was first introduced at Palmer's Opera House in New York. Now, why opera and androids? Well, opera had done puppetry for centuries, and so people in opera houses were accustomed to doing things with small creatures. This went on tour in 1895 to opera houses all around the country. And here are some reports in the news. The top one is from the Richmond Times in 1895. There's a game at the Academy of Music in Richmond, and it has those little men, and one of the patrons says, "Aren't they just the dearest, cutest little fellows you ever saw, and so polite? Why, they bow as sweetly as real live men when they're applauded." And another says, "Well, I declare I thought little Jake Wells looked positively handsome when he knocked that home run." And this continued into the 1930s. So there's an advertisement you can see at the right. I had to break it up into 2 pieces. That appeared in the Arizona Daily Star in Tucson, saying, "Watch today's World Series ball game between the Philadelphia Athletics and the St. Louis Cardinals at the Opera House. And every play will be reproduced on the playograph less than 1 minute after the play is made." And by the way, the people who were doing this sort of thing, by 1886, they had developed the language of sportscasting. So they wouldn't just say, "and it was out to Dalrymple." They would say, "and it's a high fly, and it's out to And the reason that this lasted into the 1930s was the radio people didn't know to do that. So the first person who announced a baseball game on radio, his name happened to be Harold Arlen. It was L-I-N, not L-E-N. But he told later that nobody told him he had to talk between the pitches. So most of the radio was just dead air. This is a system that was first installed at the Providence Opera House, and this is a version of it that was in Washington. 400 projectors and a team of 5. People would watch this and they'd say they forgot that they weren't at the ballpark. People would go crazy in the opera houses. So that's some baseball that appeared in opera houses. Here's some more baseball that appeared in opera houses. The left, I'm showing Cap Anson, who was one of baseball's first superstars. He was with the Chicago White Stockings, which you would think was the team that became the Chicago White Sox. It's actually the team that became the Chicago Cubs. And he was the first ball player to get top billing at an opera house. He opened at the Wheating Opera House in Syracuse and then performed at the Grand Opera House. New York Times said he did a decent job. He had previously performed in a musical by Charles Hoyt called A Bunch of Keys, but he didn't get top billing in that one. Charles Hoyt, by the way, was an opera librettist in addition to being a musical writer. Then in the middle, we have Ty Cobb, and the type is kind of small in this, so I'll read it for you. It says, "The greatest baseball player the world has ever known in the greatest college play ever written." It's kind of damning, it's faint praise, but he opened at Taylor's Opera House in Newark, New Jersey, and later performed at the Grand Opera House in Augusta. And then we have Babe Ruth, who made a tour of opera houses. He frequently performed on the same stages that Caruso performed on. But what's interesting is Babe Ruth actually sang. And they wrote a little song for him. Little by little and bit by bit, I'm making a vaudeville hit. And again, bringing it up to modern times, here's Don Mattingly as Mother Ginger in Evansville in 2011. It's a ballet he's performing in, but it was on an opera house stage. So back to Glimmerglass. Here's another Glimmerglass opera. This one is Central Park, which was a world premiere here in Cooperstown, 1999, and that's Joyce Castle, who's a spectacular opera singer, has performed at Glimmerglass many times, opera houses around the world. She was down in Brazil during the World Cup. How do you get to be that good an opera singer? Well, you need a bunch of training, and who pays for the training? Well, in the case of Joyce Castle, her father was George Malachi, who was a pitcher and had pitched to Babe Ruth. Now, she's not the only one who had that success. At the left is a picture of Geraldine Farrar as Elsa in Lohengrin. By the way, those of you here who may be baseball people, there's a tune from Lohengrin that you're all familiar with. It's dum dum da dum 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 da dum 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 da dum. Well, she was considered the first American opera superstar, and was such a superstar that what I'm showing in the middle picture there is her performing as Carmen in a movie directed by Cecil B. DeMille in the era of silent movies. So she's an opera star performing in a silent movie because everybody knew she was such a star. They wanted her. Who paid for her lessons? Her father, Sid Farrar, who was first base for Philadelphia. Now, there's a legend, and you can see there's a book called The Lore and Legends of Baseball. This appears in that book, it appears in other books, it appears in some newspapers, that Farrar's teammates saved their tinfoil and gave it to him whenever he would show up at their club. They would all hand him their tinfoil, and that paid for her trip to Europe. Great story, except Sid Farrar retired from baseball when Geraldine was 8 years old. Now, maybe he knew she was going to be a great opera singer. I can't say it didn't happen, but... And then we have this guy, pitcher Moishe Miller, who later changed his name to Robert Merrill. He played semi-pro ball in Brooklyn. He was the first person to record the Brooklyn baseball cantata that you just heard. His teammate was Tommy Holmes, who later played for the Boston Braves. And the money that he made playing baseball, he used for singing lessons. Now, why did he give up baseball? Because he said he had a 40-mile-an-hour fastball. So he changed his name to Robert Merrill, and he sang 958 opera performances at the Met. He also then, afterwards, went back into baseball and sang the national anthem for the Yankees at their opening and their postseason stuff for 3 decades. He had his own uniform, which was number 1.5. He later managed the Yankees old-timers. The old-timers of the Yankees included people like Mickey Mantle. And he died watching Game 1 of the 2004 World Series. So what brought him back into baseball after he had become an opera star? Well, it was this guy, the boss of the orchestra, in this case, George Steinbrenner, conducting. Here's Michael Todd Simpson at another Glimmerglass opera. This is Pirates of Penzance in 2006, and he played the Pirate King. Well, who played the original Pirate King? It was a guy by the name of Signor Broccolini. And there is a picture of Signor Broccolini as Captain Corcoran in HMS Pinafore. He called himself Signor Broccolini because he did most of his work in Brooklyn. And his original name was John Clark. He was born in Ireland and then played first base for Detroit. And so the great baseball historian Peter Morris wrote an article in the Baseball History Journal 9 called From First Base to Primo Basso. At the top left, I have a picture of Ara Berberian. He pitched for the Kansas City Athletics and then sang 333 operas at the Met. Down below him is a picture of Harry Howell, another pitcher. He got into opera very strangely. He had a stomach ache. And it was a persistent stomach ache, and the doctor said, well, I don't know, but if you take singing lessons, it might help. So he took singing lessons, his stomach ache went away, and he said, formerly baseball was everything, now it's music and baseball. And then we have another person who, like John Clark, made the jump from baseball to opera, Sammy Strang. Sammy Strang is the person for whom the term pinch hitter was invented, because he would always get a hit in a pinch. And he helped the Giants win the World Series in 1905, and then went to Paris, where he studied under Jean Dureski, and became an opera singer, and got offers from opera companies around the world because he was terrific, but said, no thanks. I want to play baseball. And he coached at West Point, and then coached and managed and eventually owned the Chattanooga Lookouts. And it was with the Chattanooga Lookouts that Jackie Mitchell, that 17-year-old girl that I mentioned, struck out Babe Ruth and then, Lou Gehrig and then Babe Ruth. Here's another Glimmerglass opera. This one's in 2000, called The Glass Blowers. And what's special about this opera? Well, it's who wrote it. It was written by this guy, John Philip Sousa. And this is in his band uniform. He led the United States Marine Band, which is the oldest musical institution in the United States. But he loved baseball. So he had not one, but 2 baseball teams that he traveled with his band. Why did he have 2 baseball teams? If they couldn't find anybody to play, they'd play each other. He, by the way, played baseball at the 1900 Paris World Fair. It was the first game of baseball in France since the Spalding Tour of 1889. Well, after the Black Sox scandal of 1919, when the World Series was thrown, baseball appointed a commissioner, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, and the commissioner was charged with getting baseball back its reputation. So what does the commissioner do? He says, we need a march. And who can write us a march better than John Philip Sousa? So there's a picture of Baseball Commissioner Landis with John Philip Sousa, and this was the resulting march. It's a Sousa march. But you don't know it that well because it's not one of his best ones. And there was also, by that time, as you heard from the young performers on stage, already a baseball national anthem. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But here's another Sousa march. You may be more familiar with this one. So that's the El Capitan March, and sounds like, okay, Sousa wanted to write a march, needed a name for it, so okay, he called it El Capitan. But it didn't come about that way. He actually wrote a comic opera called El Capitan, and the march is from the comic opera. And the opera was written for the DeWolf Hopper opera company. Sousa, by the way, wrote 16 comic operas, and as I mentioned before, also scored Angela or the Umpire's Revenge, probably the first baseball opera. So who performed El Capitan the first time? Well, it was this guy, DeWolf Hopper. He made his debut in another Sousa opera called Desiree. Both El Capitan and The Charlatan were written for him, and he was a super baseball fan. He was allowed to drive onto the field and the polo grounds because he was that well known by the baseball teams. A couple of other little tidbits about him. He was the husband of Hedda Hopper. Hedda Hopper was his fifth wife, and the reason she changed her name to Hedda was because all of his other wives had names that were too similar to hers. And his son was William Hopper, the actor who you may remember as the investigator Paul Drake on the Perry Mason series. Well, here's a picture of the Chicago White Stockings, Cap Anson's team in 1888. And third from the right, there's DeWolf Hopper folding his very tall frame into the picture. And next to him with the white hat is Digby Bell, who was another opera performer. And behind Digby Bell with the funny hat and holding something was the team mascot, Clarence Duval, who was another opera performer. So there's three opera performers in the team photo of the Chicago team in 1888. Well, on August 14th, 1888, DeWolf Hopper is at the Polo Grounds. He wants to see Tim Keefe, who's the pitcher, win his 20th consecutive game. Tim Keefe pitched 19 consecutive games, won them all. It's a record that still stands in Major League Baseball history. It was equaled by Rube Marquard in 1912, but that was not vested and still hasn't been vested today. By the way, Rube Marquard was another performer at opera houses, sang and danced, sometimes wore a dress. But there was a sick person on the team, so New York lost. Chicago beats New York. The New York Times says that if comedians could cry, DeWolf Hopper would certainly have cried. This was one headline in the paper. They had another headline in the paper because DeWolf Hopper had promised to take both teams to the opera that night to see Johann Strauss II's opera Prince Methuselah. So here's what happened there. Well, that's a recording he made 21 years later, but he was the very first person to recite Casey at the Bat, and he did it in the middle of Prince Methuselah, the opera. That was the introduction of baseball's most famous poem. What about baseball's most famous song? Well, this is the copyright edition of Take Me Out to the Ball Game, written by Jack Norworth and Albert von Tilzer. By the way, neither one of them had ever seen a baseball game when they wrote the song. Where was it introduced? First, give you a little of this. Okay, you heard the introduction and everything earlier, Katie Casey being the supposed daughter of the mighty Casey. Why do I have a picture here of Joseph Haydn? Well, a couple of things. One, as I mentioned before, there were lots of puppet operas. Joseph Haydn wrote a bunch of those puppet operas. But the other thing is the recording that you just heard, one of 3 hit 1908 recordings of Take Me Out to the Ball Game was by the Haydn Quartet. And they were named after the composer. This, by the way, is another instance of Take Me Out to the Ball Game in the Marx Brothers movie, 1935. They're performing Il Trovatore. The Marx Brothers have slipped Take Me Out to the Ball Game into the music. The orchestra segues from the overture to Il Trovatore to Take Me Out to the Ball Game, and Groucho starts vending down the aisles of the opera house. This, by the way, is a serious proposal today. People say, okay, opera gave baseball luxury boxes. Why doesn't baseball give opera vending? So we'll attract more people to opera houses if we have vendors in the aisles. Well, it turns out, you may have seen a cartoon that appeared in the New Yorker on April 14th this year. Says, there's no Frank like a ballpark, like an opera Frank. Here's a painting of the opening night of an opera house in Turin, Italy, Teatro Regio Torino. They were doing the opera Arsace, and I've expanded a detail down at the bottom, and you can see they have vendors, both drink vendor on the left and food vendor on the right, working the aisles during the opera. But back to Take Me Out to the Ball Game. Where did it come from? Well, here are two scholarly books that were written about Take Me Out to the Ball Game. You may recognize one of the authors of the book on the left, Tim Wiles. He used to be in charge of the Giamatti Research Center at the Baseball Hall of Fame here, and Amy Worf McGuigan on the right. They both researched heavily where it was introduced. They cannot come to 100% conclusion, and they disagree about the exact location, but they both agree it was at a Brooklyn opera house. According to the book on the left, it was at the Amphion Academy, and in the course of my research, I discovered that 6 Wagner operas were performed there by the Metropolitan Opera, and the Metropolitan Opera Archives wasn't aware of them. So they've had to renumber 2,000 operas since I made them aware of that. Or it was at the Grand Opera House in Brooklyn. This is the program for Tosca at the Grand Opera House. And I tend to go with Amy Worf McGuigan. I think she makes a really good case that it was done at the Grand Opera House. But 1908 introduced at a Brooklyn Opera House. Now, here's a famous quote about opera and baseball. Opera in English is in the main just about as sensible a plea as baseball in Italian. And that was by George Jean Nathan in the American Mercury. Some people say it was H.L. Mencken. It wasn't. It was Nathan. But he was Mencken's partner in that magazine. In 1926, there wasn't baseball in Italy, to be fair. Now there is. That's a player for the Italian national team, which ranks fairly highly. And it turns out that even fake Italian works well for opera. So here is a spoof of the opera Pagliacci that appeared on Caesar's Hour on NBC in 1955. And just got a little tiny bit of it here, which starts after the sort of Vesti la Giuba section of it. So we end with the Vesti la Giuba. And it goes on. You recognize the tune. You don't recognize the words because they don't mean anything. So, I've told you about baseball at the Opera House. How about opera on the ball field? This is San Francisco Opera doing Aida at AT&T Park in San Francisco. 32,000 fans watching a simulcast on the scoreboard coming from the War Memorial Opera House. Seems like a lot of people, really impressive. By the way, Washington National Opera started doing it after San Francisco, and in 2010, Washington National Opera did Un ballo in maschera, so they began it with an umpire getting up and saying, "Play ballo!" But 32,000 wasn't the maximum. In 1988 at Expos Stadium in Montreal, and this was not a simulcast on the scoreboard, this was a live production of Aida, It's the largest single-site, single performance, in-person opera audience ever, 44,000 people on June 18th. And by the way, another 40,000 people on June 16th. And I've spoken to someone who was there, and he said it was actually a fantastic performance. Here is Opera Under the Stars at Navin Field in Detroit in 1935. And were they unique? No. Here's at an older stadium in Montreal. It's now known as Dalhousie Stadium at McGill University. In 1930, doing Aida. Aida premiered at the Polo Grounds in 1923. Then Ebbets Field had opera. Cleveland Municipal Stadium had opera. There were many operas. But even before that, here is an ad that appeared in the Chicago Tribune in 1916. Now, what's significant about 1916, this is before there were PA systems. The Metropolitan Opera took Siegfried on a baseball stadium tour. So they opened at Forbes Field in Pittsburgh. Everything was fine except Act 3 got rained out, so everybody got rain checks. They came back the next day and saw Act 3 completing the opera. They were supposed to play at what we now call Wrigley Field. That's what this ad is for. It wasn't owned by the Wrigleys yet, so it's just called Cubs Baseball Park. That got rained out. The next one that they were doing was at Robeson Field in St. Louis. And by the way, they were fine in Cincinnati later in the tour. But at Robeson Field, the people at the field were worried that the stage was going to damage the infield. And so they made them put the stage very far back. So the conductor raises his baton, gives the downbeat, the orchestra starts playing, and all the people in the stands, 12,000 opera fans, don't hear a thing. So they storm the field, and they rip the benches and chairs out of the stands and take them down on the field, destroy the infield completely, but crowd around the stage and they can hear it. Even before that, there were opera companies who had ball teams. So here is a report in the New York Times in 1870 of Tony Pastor's Opera House versus the Olympic. The Opera House won, by the way. And then down at the bottom, the beginning of the Boston-New York baseball rivalry. It was not the professional teams, it was the opera companies. And so you can see in this headline in the New York, opera ball team trounces Boston. They got even with their rivals. Now, why are they their rivals? Well, you can see where they played at the right. That's the Huntington Avenue American League baseball grounds, which is the site of the first World Series ever. And the building that you see at the right behind the ball field, that's the Boston Opera House. So 1909 was the first time they played. Otto Kahn was essentially in charge of the Metropolitan Opera. He headed their board, but he was effectively their entire board. He gets wind that the house would like to have an opera ball team. He says, great. He buys them uniforms and everything. He's also on the board of the Boston Opera. So he says, great, let's arrange a match. He sends the ball players up by boat so they'll be well rested. They get up there, they lose. Oh, well, baseball's a democratic game. These things happen. But then word gets out that Boston hired a ringer. Otto Kahn is furious. So he demands a rematch in New York, and they have two ringers now. One from the team that became the Yankees, it was called the Highlanders at the time, and another one from the Giants. And so New York trounces Boston, and that's the beginning of the rivalry. Final Glimmerglass opera, An American Tragedy, is being performed this year. And you see that the opera is by Tobias Picker and Gene Shear. But the opera is based on a book. So here's the book it was based on, Theodore Dreiser's novel, An American Tragedy. And where did Theodore Dreiser live? He lived in this building called the Ansonia. Now, it opened in 1904, and it had a rooftop farm for fresh eggs and milk. It had climate controls before air conditioning, so they had freezing saline pipes that went through the building. It had 24-hour room service. It had thick walls because it had those pipes in it. It also had pneumatic tubes and so on. It had 2 indoor pools. One of them was the world's largest at the time. Indoor miniature golf. And it was near an express stop of the brand new subway. So the first 4 things, made it very attractive to opera singers because the thick walls meant they could perform and wouldn't be disturbed. And the other things were very attractive to ball players, so it turned out to be an extremely popular place with both ball players and opera singers. The Black Sox scandal was initiated in Chick Gandil's room at the Ansonia. Christy Walsh, who was baseball's first agent, signed Babe Ruth at the Ansonia. He showed up with a case of beer, pretended somebody had sent it and that he was just delivering it, and then he got in and signed it. Ty Cobb, who got rich by investing in Coca-Cola, he made the investment at the Ansonia. Ray Chapman, who is the only person in Major League Baseball history to be killed by a pitch, he was staying at the Ansonia the day that he was killed. And in opera, you have singers, conductors, composers, impresarios, all staying at the Ansonia. And Eleanor Steber did a recording in the basement pool with the audience wearing formal black towels for the occasion. By the way, the building still exists, and it has a little Babe Ruth museum in it that you can visit. So here are two of the famous residents. There's Babe Ruth, and he's playing the saxophone. He could use his musical talents because no one else could hear them outside his apartment. And at the right, those are the Tristan and Isolde that Lou Gehrig had heard, and the guy on the right is Lauritz Melchior, who's a very, very large person. Now, Babe Ruth would wander the halls in his robe to go to the elevator down to the basement barber to have his daily shave. Lauritz Melchior couldn't fit in the bathtub in his apartment. So he wandered the halls in his robe, taking the elevator down to one of the pools, which is where he had to bathe. But the two most famous people at the Ansonia were Enrico Caruso and Babe Ruth, and they were the epitomes of their art. So people would be called the Babe Ruth of something. So people who were called the Babe Ruth of opera included Caruso, Beniamino Gigli, Luciano Pavarotti, and even Maria Callas was called the Babe Ruth of opera. And people called the Caruso of baseball, Babe Ruth, of course, Joe DiMaggio, Lou Fonseca, and then Marty McHale. And even those of you who are baseball people in the room probably don't know who Marty McHale was. He played for the Red Sox, and he was a really good singer. And there he is with the Red Sox quartet. He's the guy on the left. So these two were the most famous of their arts or professions at the Ansonia, and reporters would hang out to ask them questions. And a reporter once asked Enrico Caruso what he thought of famous Ansonia resident Babe Ruth, and his response was, "I don't know, I never heard her sing." So on that, I will be happy to take questions, and again, there's much more at that baseball and opera site. I know some of you have a matinee to go to, so feel free to leave at any time. But if anyone has questions, I will be happy to stay until the last question is answered. Yes?
That last joke you just made about Caruso, I thought that those two guys actually became friends when they were living in the building. Is that true or not?
I don't know. It's not clear that Caruso ever had an apartment at the Ansonia. He was at the Ansonia a lot. He was visiting other opera singers, composers, conductors, and so on. So he was there a lot, but whether he had an apartment there, there's doubt about that. He stayed mostly at the Knickerbocker. Any other questions? Yes?
You said that some of those baseball players perform, and you said you sang. Was it vaudeville style performance? What did they do?
Yeah. In the case of Cap Anson and Ty Cobb, they didn't do any singing, they acted. So Cap Anson first acted in one play that Charles Hoyt had written, a musical play, but he didn't sing, he just acted, and it was a minor role. And then the one called A Runaway Colt that he got star billing for, at that time the team that became the Cubs was known as the Colts. And so Hoyt actually wrote a musical about the Colts, figuring that since these guys don't have acting experience, it would be best if they simply played themselves. And so they did. Ty Cobb played a football player in The College Widow. But there were some performers who actually sang. One of them, at the time of Cap Anson, the other baseball superstar was Mike Kelly. And there was a song written for him called Slide, Kelly, Slide. And he would sing. He would also perform the poem Casey at the Bat at various places. And he never claimed to have written it, but Ernest Thayer, who wrote the poem, got the idea that Kelly claimed to have written it, and there was a big dispute between them. And then Rube Marquard, who I mentioned, was a performer. He did sing and dance with his wife. And he performed in a skit called The Suffragette Pitcher, where he put on women's clothes to play, which was actually a common thing that happened in baseball at the time. There were women's teams, and they would frequently hire male players, and the males had to put on wigs and dresses so that they would look like women. The opposite happened with that 17-year-old girl who struck out Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth. She later performed with a team of men who had beards, and she put on a fake beard. Any other questions? Yes?
Is there any recording of that Babe Ruth song?
I don't know. I haven't really searched. The thing I've searched for is even the music for Angela or The Umpire's Revenge, and it doesn't seem to exist. The complete libretto exists at the Library of Congress and is easily accessible, but the music doesn't seem to exist. Yes?
The concessions through the Opera House, how was that done in the middle of an opera? Is this something that they pre-ordered, or do you know anything about that?
I'm sorry? The concessions. I don't know, and I'm not sure it's accurate. It's certainly in the painting. And there are other paintings that show concession-type things happening in the Opera House. But there's this legend that it has become fact in the opera world, which is that Richard Wagner was the first person to darken the Opera House because he wanted everybody just to concentrate on the stage. But in fact, prior to the middle of the 19th century, it was common to darken the Opera House. And the reason for that is we think of the Opera House as being candlelit. And when we think of that, we think of today's candles. And today's candles got invented around the middle of the 19th century. But before that, candles had wicks that didn't burn. So the wax would go down, but the wick would just get bigger and bigger and bigger until it got to this gigantic flame. And so the way you dealt with that was with something called a snuffer, which was a specialized pair of scissors that would trim the wick. Now, if you had candles and sconces on either side of the Opera House, no problem. You hire a footman, he goes around and he trims the wicks. If you have candles on stage, no problem. Part of the duties of the singer were to go around to the candles and trim the wicks. But what do you do with the chandelier? You can't trim the wicks. And if the flame gets that big, the candle's going to burn out, the wax is going to pour on the patrons underneath. So starting in the 17th century in Venice, in the very first opera houses, the ceiling would open, the chandelier would be taken up into the ceiling would close, the opera house would be dark, they would perform the opera, and then at the end they would relight the chandelier, bring it back down to provide exit lighting. So I don't think that in the 18th century in Turin there were actually vendors in the aisles. Maybe they had sconce lighting and the vendors worked in the dark. It's possible. Yes?
When you talked about opera houses in the 19th century showing baseball games using mechanical devices, now are opera houses the first venue to think of showing baseball games away from baseball stadiums, or was that an idea?
It's a tiny bit older than the Opera House. The very first time that it was shown was in the Masonic Theater in Nashville in 1884. And the first time it was in an opera house was probably 1885 in Augusta or Nashville, and then 1886 in Atlanta. So there was a tiny bit before the Opera House. Now, well before that, starting in the 1870s, there were sports bars where they would do the same kind of thing, and they would have the telegraph operator telegraph the information to the sports bar, but all they did was write the results on a blackboard. And so you could look up from your billiard table and see what was happening in the game. And there were also people who gathered around newspaper offices to watch this happening. And there was something called the baseball bulletin that was very common in newspaper offices. And one of the last pictures I have, I give a talk just on the systems for watching baseball games before television. And the last picture I have is of the Montrose Press in Montrose, Colorado, and it's 1939 by the time radio had really taken over from this kind of stuff, and there's just 10 people hanging out outside the newspaper office watching stuff. But I have other pictures with many thousands of people. There were 70,000 people in Herald Square watching one of these systems on a playograph at the Evening Telegraph building. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for coming.